Okay, so welcome back everybody to our second chapter in environmental science. So in this chapter, we're going to go through a lecture where we kind of introduce the idea of environmental ethics and kind of what exactly ethics has to do with environmental science and how it really determines our, you know, ideas and decisions on kind of how we use our environment and our resources, and then kind of the interrelated connections based around those choices. So for our outline, we'll go over these topics. So call for new ethics, talk about environmental ethics, environmental attitudes, justice. We'll look at some disasters versus poverty, societal ethics, corporate environmental ethics, and we'll talk about individual environmental ethics. Then we'll look at the ethics of consumption. So basically, how much you consume per person or a country compared to your population size. Then we'll look at personal choices, and then we'll talk about or finish up with global environmental ethics. Okay, so here's just an example of an environmental and ethical dilemma. So, a decision that we have to make that could potentially be a hard decision because it leads to the loss of one species. So, the example here is salmon and sea lions are both protected species. Sea lions feed on the salmon, and we only have the funds and the capability to protect one of those species, right? So, which species should we protect more? Is it the salmon or is it the sea lions? And who ultimately decides which species should we protect? Who has that deciding power, kind of that deciding capability of, we choose to put all of our funds and resources into this one species versus another. And that's a decision that's made all the time in conservation. Sometimes we just don't have the funds to save every species in a particular situation, and that's just a case of reality. We're limited in our resources, and so this falls back on kind of this ethical dilemma, right? So your ethics will come in and your morality on, you know, which one should I save? What are the guiding decisions to this? And so this is some of the stuff or some of the things we're going to talk about in this lecture. So first thing we're going to talk about is a call for a new ethic, right? So remember in the first chapter, we talked about interrelatedness and how everything we do has a connection with something else. And so a lot that we do on our planet will connect to something or somebody else, even if it seems so insignificant. Most of the time, you're affecting something. Um, the big thing is that managing the interactions has been kind of scaled up over the last decades, or 10s to 20 of years or so. Um, and the difficulty with kind of managing these interactions that are increasing, at this rate, fast rate, largely because of population size and a bunch of other factors, because we're modifying the environment so much now, that it really increases the rate, the scale of these interactions, and the complexity of the interactions. So it's not just like a simple interaction as to where, you know, you cut down a tree and now all of a sudden a plant doesn't have shade. There's this domino effect, like we talked about with the wolf interactions in Yellowstone, where it's really like this web or network of interactions. And across the world, we have many people that think that environmental challenges need to be met with more, or I should say better and more robust environmental ethics. So we should kind of bring about this idea of solidifying new ethical kind of guidelines on how we're going to manage our environments in the natural world based off of how we transform it or how it is being transformed. And so what is ethics? Well, ethics is just a part of philosophy. So remember, environmental science is super interdisciplinary, right? So we're going to talk about a lot of different fields as we go through this course, and ethics is one of them. It's a branch of philosophy where we're defining what exactly is right and wrong in terms of decisions and actions and choices that people can make. And ethics kind of really guides us in understanding what's wrong, what's right, and not only what's wrong, but why they're wrong. And so why shouldn't we do this? And so when we take ethics and we apply it to the environmental world, we get environmental ethics. And so we're applying that ethical thinking to the natural world and also the relationships that people have with the earth, right? And so how our actions are affecting the earth, right? And so basically it's saying you can't just, hunt a species to extinction. There are some ethics behind that we need to consider. And so despite the presence of some differences, there are, a lot of cases and differences. I mean, like differences globally between populations and groups of people. And so even though we have those differences, there are a lot of environmental ethics and ethical committees that should be globally agreed upon. So we should have these global environmental ethics. And with environmental ethics, we're really kind of thinking about three big propositions. So first is that the earth has life that exists on it, and we have a moral status. And so those creatures, those organisms, those living things that are on the globe should have our ethical concern, right? So they shouldn't just be there to be removed because we want to or we need that resource, and so we're just going to completely remove it, right? This is saying we should have an ethical concern and think about whether or not it's right or wrong and why it's wrong to, hunt a species to extinction or to clear a forest, etc. So any kind of changes we make on the environment. The other two key propositions is that the earth and all of the organisms have intrinsic value, right? Meaning that just because they exist, they have a moral value. And that moral value is not only because they meet our needs, right? So this is basically saying, no, we should. So for the example of, hunting a species almost to extinction or to extinction, it's not saying, oh, we should think about these ethics because if we hunt it to extinction, then we can't use its resources. So that would be just meeting human needs. This is saying that the species should have ethical concern because it merely exists, right? And so because it exists, we should think about whether or not it's ethically right or wrong to, hunt a species or fish a species to extinction. The last idea or principle is the concept of an ecosystem. And what this is saying is that we should really consider wholes, meaning whole ecosystems, whole communities, and not just kind of one species or one part of that ecosystem. So we should think about the entire ecosystem because everything is interrelated and interconnected, right? So we want to include other forms of life and the environment in those ethical concerns and propositions. Now, sometimes there can be conflicting ethical propositions, right? So sometimes other individuals' ethical concerns or commitments can basically conflict with one another, right? So, for example, we might have a mayor who has an ethical commitment to preserving land in the city, but he also has an ethical commitment to bring jobs to the city. So the mayor then has to decide, do they preserve this land and the species and organisms that live on it, or do they build a new factory and provide jobs? And so the mayor has a big decision because they then have to weigh all of these responses and choices that happen behind the scenes of, these interactions. Well, if you clear the land, what happens to that? Is it land that's providing a lot of resources? If you clear that land, is it removing a whole ecosystem? Does that make an ecosystem not function anymore? Does it destroy the health of that ecosystem? And if so, do worse conditions for the people in the surrounding area? Do they get poor water? Does the water become polluted? Um, does the clearing of the land lead to dust being blown into the air, which creates bad breathing conditions? What about a factory? Like when you build a factory, you're creating jobs, but are you creating more pollution or more, greenhouse gas emissions? Or, so there's a lot of choices that you should think about whenever you make a decision like this. And so this may seem like a simple decision, but underneath everything, it's very complicated. And there's a lot of ethics behind which one is the correct decision. And generally, there probably isn't a correct decision. It's basically, you know, leading to which one has the least amount of risk and brings the most benefit, basically, for whatever needs is in that situation. Most cases, though, what's good for the environment is also good for the people, because if you have a healthy ecosystem, a functioning ecosystem, that ecosystem is going to do a lot of ecosystem services for the neighboring communities. Like like our previous example, you'll have water, you'll have fresh water, you'll have resources that you can get from the environment. And like this example says, while forest protection may reduce some jobs like logging, and it may reduce the amount of timber that we get because we didn't log that area, a healthier forest could lead to new jobs in terms of park rangers, recreation, fisheries, tourism, could bring more income to the community. And so, you know, again, there's these ethics and decisions behind, what decision do you make? Do you clear the forest, or do you keep the ecosystem healthy and use its resources and ecosystem services? And so there's this there's this thing where um, environmental issues used to be considered to only be the concern of scientists, lawyers, and policymakers, right? And so it's basically, bringing about this idea that, these people are kind of the heralds of the environmental issues. Okay? But if so leaving it to them, then our moral responsibility is towards future generations with these environmental issues. Okay. And the natural world actually is kind of this big figure in a lot of the world's religions, right? And so not only is our scientists, lawyers, and policymakers involved in these environmental issues, but a lot of an individual's beliefs or kind of cultures are tied to the natural environment. So for example, religious leaders recognize, right, that religions, shape these cultures, shape our values, and really make a contribution on our environmental decisions and kind of how we look at the environment. And so the National Religious Partnership of the Environment, so NRPE, was developed and founded in 93, where their mission was to care for God's creation across all areas of organized religion, right? So basically bringing this idea of care and ethics to the natural world, to ecosystems, even though you may not be part of the scientists, the lawyers, or the policymakers that you look at as conserving these environments. Basically, kind of bringing it to a more personable, individual level. Okay. Whenever we look at environmental ethics, there's three philosophical approaches to how somebody can kind of value the environment. The three are anthropocentrism, can't talk this morning, biocentrism, and ecocentrism. Okay, so anthro is where the people look at the environment as only providing value to humans, right? So that's this top figure here. My laser pointer. Right, so this top figure here, okay? So basically it's only providing value to the humans, and so they're only going to protect it when it benefits them, okay? Biocentrism is basically all living organisms have an inherent value, right? This is saying if it's alive, it's living, it has a value, we need to protect and respect it, and this includes humans, right? Ecocentrism is kind of taking this more holistic approach, right? And it's basically saying that ecosystems, not only the organisms that are inside these areas, but every aspect of the ecosystem, even the non-living components, right? The soil structure, the water that's there, right? They have an inherent value, right? These ecosystems have a value, and we need to protect the whole ecosystem and not just the living organisms, right? Because a lot of times you'll see that funding really only allows us to kind of be at this level where we're conserving a single species, right? Ecocentrism basically says we need to conserve ecosystems. We need to protect the holistic idea of ecosystems and not really focus on a single species. But that requires a lot of work, a lot of funding, and it's often very difficult to accomplish. And we have Aldo Leopold stating from his Sand County Almanac, published in 49. He has this pretty famous quote here. It says, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community," so the living community. "It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So when we abuse the land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us, when we see land as a commodity to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect." Right? So it's basically bringing about the idea of ecocentrism. And so he's saying, this holistic idea of, preserving the integrity of an ecosystem. And whenever we start to kind of see the land as a commodity that we're also a part of, right? It's not just the land itself. We tend to make better choices in regards to protecting that environment. Okay. So with the kind of ethical approaches, right? We basically have combined kind of all of these decisions into one basically term like ethics, right? But the reality is that your ethical commitments, right? So what determines how you make a decision, whether you think something is right or wrong, can actually be pulled in different directions and even at different times. So you may you may think a certain way at one point in time, but then under a different scenario, you may think kind of the opposite way in terms of ethics towards the environment. And so because you have these kind of ways that ethics can kind of flow, we can make it easier to talk about when we can categorize it into different attitudes or approaches. Okay. And so we're going to talk about these three different approaches: the developmental approach, preservation, and conservation approach. Okay. So all of these approaches are basically different attitudes that individuals have towards nature, and it's based off of their personal ethical commitments. So basically how they view the environment under that particular, situation or choice. Okay. So first looking at development. So this approach follows the anthro anthropocentric um, ethical approach, where it basically is saying that we should just rule nature, right? We're the master of nature, and that all of the natural resources are ours to benefit from, and we should be able to take it and use it as we please. The enforcement of this approach is heavily backed by kind of the capitalist work ethic, to where you are getting the most out of your resources as you can and trying to get the biggest profit, right? So this approach is really big on human creativity and looks at economic growth for the moral idea of society, right? So you're saying, okay, we're getting these resources, we're providing economic growth, so this is why we're doing or treating the natural environment basically the way we're treating it. This differs heavily from the preservation approach. Preservation approach is your ecocentric based approach, or the most ecocentric based approach. And this basically says that nature has an intrinsic value that is apart or separated from human uses, right? So not only can humans use resources from nature, but nature itself has its own intrinsic value just by existing, okay? And this approach was heavily backed by preservationists such as John Muir, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, and they basically all looked at nature as a refuge from economic activity and not a resource for economic activity, right? We all know, though, that we can't exist without using resources from nature, right? So being pure ecocentric in this view is most likely very difficult to accomplish and sustain the human race, right? Or at least at its current size. Um, and what preservationists want to do is to keep large parts of nature intact for aesthetic, so viewing or recreational reasons, right? Um, and this is done all across the globe, as you can see, in national parks and state parks, etc., where depending on the level of conservation, some of those areas can't have resources harvested from them, and they're basically preserved for aesthetic or recreational reasons. And some of them are preserved at a level to where there's not much human activity in those areas. Now, the kind of middle ground between these two is the conservation approach. So this approach is looking at how we can take unrestrained development and preservationism and kind of meet a middle ground. So conservationism is basically saying we want humans to have resources, to have well-being, but we also want to look at the long-term sustainability of our natural environment. So we're really concerned about environmental management. And so a lot of these ideas are known around the approach of sustainable development. Okay, so basically, we want to take resources from this environment, but we want to do so sustainably to where that ecosystem is going to be healthy and it's going to function at a normal level. And our interactions have been taken into account based off of our knowledge and everything we know. and we're going to harvest and use resources from that ecosystem in that way. Excuse me. And now, while there may be some unintentional consequences because we don't know everything about ecosystems and we don't know how all the interactions are going to play out, but again, we can do our best we can work to our best ability to try to maintain this form of sustainable development. And basically, sustainable development is this middle ground where, again, you're conserving ecological health of the landscape, right? So the area of sustainability is in the center of this Venn diagram, right? So you have your social impacts, your environmental impacts, and your economic impacts, right? And so if you're doing social and environment, right, we're at a bearable area. If you're doing environment economic, you're viable. Economic and social, you're equitable. But if you're all of these are kind of meeting in the middle ground, we're at this sustainable area where that ecosystem can remain healthy. Okay. Now, we've talked about kind of ethics and choices that, you know, or kind of what backs the idea of how people view the environment, and under different principles and kind of the range of views that we can have. Now we're going to kind of switch into talking about environmental justice. So in 1998, the EPA, so Environmental Protection Agency, defined environmental justice as such, okay? So basically it says that no group of people, including racial, ethnic, or socioeconomic groups, should bear a disproportionate share of negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, municipal, and commercial operations or the execution of federal, state, local, and tribal programs and policies. So environmental justice, like this says, is really related to civil rights. And it's basically saying that if one group, business, a culture, a group of people, whatever, if a group of individuals makes a change on the environment and the consequences of that environmental change has a larger negative impact on a different group, then that is falling under this definition of environmental justice, right? So it's saying no group of people should bear a disproportionate share of negative environmental consequences. So if there's environmental consequences, it should be evenly spread out. However, that's not always the case. Basically, studies have shown that the affluent members of society, right, will generate most of the waste, but the impoverished, the poor members, tend to bear the burden of this waste, right? So this is falling under this concept of environmental justice. So the affluent members are providing a disproportional negative impact of environmental, negative changes on the lower class, the lower population, and that is disproportionate. right? And so this again falls under that environmental justice concept. Environmental justice can cover a wide range of issues. So there's things like, where do you put hazardous and polluting facilities, transportation, safe housing. What about lead poisoning? We have to think about water quality. Everybody should have access to recreation, but that's not always the case. Noise pollution, environmental information, having access to that. So some classes of individuals of the population have different access compared to others. Hazardous waste cleanup, and then exposure to natural disasters. Okay. So looking at natural disasters, it's actually shown that, or evidence suggests that natural disasters affect the lower class to a much greater degree than the upper class. Right? So poor minority residents generally were left behind instead of evacuating before Hurricane Katrina came in or made landfall. And so they were disproportionately affected by that natural disaster compared to the upper class, middle class population. And we see in kind of Western societies that these populations of individuals tend to act as if we have unlimited natural resources, we have unlimited space to build up and assimilate waste, and we can basically accommodate any kind of growth. So basically this unchecked growth of our populations. And until kind of the last part of the 20th century, economic growth and resource exploitation were the dominant orientations. So kind of the dominant kind of sides that people took towards the natural environment in these industrialized societies. Right? So basically, most of the outlooks of individuals kind of led to this way, especially in Western societies. However, recently there's been kind of this change to where people are really starting to look at the environment and kind of move towards the environmental ethics and environmental concern and protecting our environment. So what we're going to look at now are kind of the different levels of environmental ethics, right? So the first one we're going to look at is corporations, okay? So corporations are legal entities designed to operate at a profit. So basically they're providing a service, making something, providing a good, and they're getting a profit from selling that product, selling that service to the population, okay? So the corporation's primary purpose is to generate financial return, especially for its shareholders who's put in money to make that corporation successful. They want their money back. So they need to do operation so that they can get that financial return for their shareholders. And so even though that corporation is main goal is to generate profit, that doesn't mean that they're not obligated to have, ethical obligations, right? So that means that they don't have any ethical obligations, right? They do. Worded that badly, but basically, even though they're trying to generate a profit, they still have ethical obligations to the public, right? Or to the natural world. And in fact, the shareholders can demand that the corporation be run ethically, and those decisions can flow from the shareholders down through the employees and the executives who make those decisions and implement them. Now, with the corporations, right, you are generating waste and you're generating pollution. Every building needs energy to run. got to burn coal or gas or get energy from somewhere. And if it's not a environmental friendly resource to get energy, then it's generating some sort of pollution, right? Some sort of waste. Also, the um, products that the corporations are making or services they're providing can also generate waste and pollution. And so, whenever we look at what a corporation has in terms of dividing its cost, you basically have research and development, right? Getting out new services, better products, etc. They have to advertise those products. They have to get the raw materials to provide their service or products, and they have to build those things. That generates waste and pollution, and so they have to pay for that waste and pollution control. And they have salaries, they have administrative costs, and then after that, everything else is profit, right? Where ethics comes in is especially around this area. If that corporation decides to cut corners in that waste disposal and pollution control to maximize the profit, right? So if they can shrink this bar down, right, and that means that this profit margin up here gets wider. So if they cut corners, they maximize profit, but they're doing that without regard to the public or environmental well-being, and they're implementing or falling into that environmental justice definition to where now that corporation is disproportionately providing negative environmental impacts to the rest of the community and the population. And so because stockholders really expect a return on an investment, right, corporations kind of make decisions based off of short-term profitability rather than long-term. So they don't really, I don't want to say they don't care, but a lot of decisions aren't thinking about long-term benefit to environment or society. A lot of times they're just doing the minimum to satisfy, the government and the Environmental Protection Agency and, whatever environmental laws and regulations they have to follow. And so they'll, minimize that amount of funding going into that. Generally, they don't put too much more over that voluntarily, right? Because they want that profit margin to be as high as possible. So, is there a corporate environmental ethic, right? So, if they dump waste or if they, they spew out a lot of greenhouse gas or smog, or they don't install this wastewater treatment facility or use the best filters to minimize the amount of pollution that goes into rivers, then what they're doing by kind of cutting those corners is they're externalizing the cost to the public. So basically, whenever they dump that waste into a river, instead of building a wastewater treatment facility, the public then has to pay the cost of that pollution going into the river. So greenwashing basically is a form of corporate misinformation, okay, where a company will basically say, oh, we have a green image and we have these green incentives, but in reality, this is misleading, okay? So they're basically saying, oh, we're green, we're environmental friendly, but their actions aren't really environmental friendly. And they're externalizing those costs to the public, right? So the public is going to have to pay the cost of drinking water that's polluted, of, dealing with a nasty river or having to clean that, etc. Right? So those costs are being externalized to the public. And so corporations have choices that they make, right, between using environmental friendly production processes or harmful ones. And with the change of kind of how the public views the environment, so moving more from that anthropocentrism to kind of this latter two of conservation, ecocentrism, then they're kind of pushing and forcing a lot of these corporations to be more environmentally responsible in terms of their practices, right? And so there's these sustainability reporting guidelines, there's SERI's principles, there's the International Organization for Standardization, which is pushing all of these corporations to really go for a more sustainable, environmental friendly footprint in their everyday kind of doings. And you know, there's this idea of, so, well, if we conserve the environment, right? So if we focus on the environment, that may cause an economic collapse, okay? And so that makes little sense, right? So we don't want to just, forget everything in terms of the way economics works and just put everything into conserving natural resources and allow kind of our economic and social structure to collapse. But what we want to do is we want to kind of fall under the lines of this natural capitalism, whereas it's the idea that businesses can expand profits, but they also can take good care of the environment, right? So we're not on this extreme to where we care for the environment so much that the economy collapses, and we're not on this extreme here to where we're worried about profits so much that we externalize the cost and cause all these negative effects for our communities and our neighbors, public neighbors. Um, so we want to kind of be in the middle ground. And so, for example, the 3M company has saved up to 500 million over the last 20 years through the pollution prevention pays program. So this 3P program. So they've basically undergone these pollution regulations and chosen to be environmentally friendly. And in the long term, it's actually saved them a ton of money, right? It may have costed money in the short term to kind of get this going, but the profit that they've gotten over long term has been substantial, and they're doing good towards the environment. Okay. Another green business concept is industrial ecology. And so what this does is it links production with environmental quality. Okay. Basically, nothing is wasted and discarded, and everything gets used or reused. And basically the pollutant is a resource that's out of place. Okay. And so it models this idea of industrial production, biological production, and it really looks at where wastes are going. And you want to minimize waste actually being put into the environment. Any waste needs to be reused or recycled in some way, so that it doesn't end up as a pollutant, right? And so, like this says, good environmental practices are good economics. And as we've seen with the 3M, good environmental practices can actually generate you money. And the last part of the green business concept is that there's this what's known as the triple bottom line. So it's being referred to as kind of the ethical criteria for business success. And you really want to look at social, environmental, financial, economical concerns, right? So if you have these three concerns in your corporation, then you're going to do better in the long run in terms of your economics, your social impacts, and also your environmental impacts. Now, again, it may cost up front, but in the long term, having that healthy environment, reducing pollution, reducing waste is going to be more beneficial in the long run than it is in the short term. Next, what we're going to look at are individual environmental ethics. Okay? So ethical changes in society and businesses have to start at the individual level, right? We're sitting here saying, okay, corporations can make these decisions to be environmentally conscious, but it actually starts with one person. One person in that corporation has to bring up the idea, has to say, okay, we need to focus on being environmentally friendly, or, we can stick with the, way we're running the corporation instead. And so that individual has to recognize that their individual actions actually impact environmental quality, and that we all have a responsibility for the quality of the environment and that we live in. So a lot of us want the environment cleaned up, but we don't want to make the necessary lifestyle changes. We don't want to drive less. We don't want to ride our bikes to work. We don't want to eat less meat or grow our own food. And so we don't want to do without our, lights or our swimming pool, and that uses water, or our green gardens or our green yards, or whatever, right? And so we have a hard time making those lifestyle changes that would really benefit the environment. And a lot of the times we would say, well, it's just me making these changes, so it's not going to make a difference, right? But it's just like the idea of voting. If 1,000 people say that, then that's 1,000 votes lost, right? And so if 1,000 people say, well, my decisions can't change the environment, so I'm not going to change, then that's 1,000 people that's still, providing excess pollutants or overusing water, or, whatever. And when we look at it, especially in terms of North Americans, right, our population size is about 5% of the world's population. However, we consume almost a quarter of the world's oil. We use more water and own more cars than pretty much any other country. And we waste more food than what most people in the sub-Saharan African continent eat, which is pretty insane, right? When you think about it that way, it makes you kind of think about, how we impact the world. And it's larger than just us, right? And we have an impact. And so, for example, when we consume things, right, our food, comes from the grocery store, which is from these high yield crops. And while these high yield crops have doubled the world's food production in the past 40 years, in combination with fertilizer and pesticides, it's the food distribution that is the kind of issue of hunger. So we have food, it's just getting it to those places where the populations are starving is the difficult part. And the energy consumptions that we have or use is just insane. Research has suggested that at the current rates of consumption, our known oil reserves, so the oil reserves that have been mapped and are known, will not last through the current century. Basically saying we'll use those up by the end of this century. And energy companies are looking ahead to try to kind of curb this by investing into technologies, into renewable resources that will replace fossil fuels. So we're looking at things like solar power, nuclear power, wave power, biomass technologies. And a lot of countries are increasing the proportion of energy from these renewable resources compared to fossil fuels. Water is another big issue. Um, Humans use about half the planet accessible supply of renewable fresh water. Um, Water may limit, may be one of the limiting resources in the next century. Water is a big, big factor, a big resource. Everybody needs water. Every living thing needs water. And with our boundaries and with the way we set things up, um, the politics and um, the like the environmental health of water is going to be a big concern moving forward in the future. And then the wild nature. So every day in the U.S., we have about 1,000 to 2,000 hectares of farmland and natural areas being lost to development. So that means we are losing these ecosystems to urban areas, to development, whatever it is, which means that those ecosystem services are being lost and are most likely not going to be able to be gained back. And so, like I mentioned, we can make lifestyle changes that actually reduce our impact on the planet. One of the ways we can, or some of the ways we can do this, is to eat food locally that is low on the food chain, uses minimal fertilizers and pesticides. Fertilizers and pesticides are like so energetically high in terms of the energy it uses to produce those things. Um, our food has to be shipped around the country. Um, and so if you're not buying locally, the food that you eat has used a lot of energy to get to your table. Um, and if you want to make sure you're buying durable products or reusing or repairing products, um, so that there's a less need to make more things, right? And the raw materials that we get in our products are extracted from the environment. And so if you can reuse and recycle stuff, it reduces the amount of materials that are going to be used. Trying to conserve less energy, road and home, reduces the amount of fossil fuels. Living in a town rather than suburbs, basically because you're reducing your commute time. But then, you could say, well, I live in a town, so, you know, this is part of the urban impact, right? But this is kind of like a double-edged sword, because you have to think about, what is the city footprint? Are you adding to it, or are you using something that's already there, etc.? But this is basically looking at drive time, commute time, kind of lowering that energy impact and pollution. And then also lobbying for protection of wild areas, being informed so you can vote for officials who are going to be environmentally conscious, take the environment serious, and contribute that way. Um, and we have a discussion coming up that talks about ecological footprint, and I believe we define the ecological footprint in an upcoming chapter. But basically, you can look at how much energy you use, how much resources you use, and it can really be eye-opening, this discussion activity, where you see, if every person lived like you on the earth, how many earths it would need to sustain our population. And on average, it's like 5.3 earths or something like that. So every person is living and using resources to where if all other 7 billion people lived like I did, right, it would take 6 Earths to sustain everybody, and that's not a good sign, right? And so we all need to kind of think about how we live our lives and make personal choices to kind of reduce our carbon footprint. And it's very hard to move out of that mindset because we all love our quality of life assurances, but we kind of need to think about our impacts on the environment as well. Now, I'm not saying go change your lives or any of that. I'm just saying think about it, be mindful, at least be educated about it, right? Um, and so what we're going to kind of finish up with is global environmental ethics. Right? So ecological degradation in any nation will affect the quality of lives of others, right? Because it's all interconnected. Okay. So a lot of the environmental crisis is kind of tied to this poverty gap, right, between the rich and poor nations. And environmental ethics is saying that we have an obligation beyond minimizing harm we cause to our fellow human citizens, right? So when we degrade environments, we cause harm to other populations. And it's also saying that we have an obligation to minimize the harm we cause to ecological systems and biodiversity. So it's interconnected. It's humans, biodiversity, ecological systems, right? They're all interconnected. We don't want to focus on one, we want to focus on all three. Okay. And so, yeah, so that's it for this chapter. Go ahead and read through the summary, kind of make sure you've got everything down for this chapter. And as always, let me know if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, and we'll see you in the next chapter.